Welcome to Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading a story, but first up we are going to be reading the Bible. The Bible. Then we are going to be doing
Fellowship of the Ring.
the Fellowship of the Ring. The Lord of the Rings, yeah. Fellowship of the Ring, Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell, and never miss another video. And I think at the end there might be an art gallery.
No art gallery today.
No art gallery today. Okay, no art gallery. Here's Dad.
Hello. Oh, you know what? I forgot to set my light. Be ready to be blinded. Okay. So, this is Luke chapter 20. Luke. That's the new way to say Luke. It's like Luke, but Luke. Luke. All right. So, excuse me. All right, Luke chapter 20. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible. And the Bible. And here we go. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up and said to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority." He answered them, "I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" And they discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants, and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third one. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies. Interesting that they feared the people and not God. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. A little bit of commentary there. I think that we as Christians get caught on the first half of that verse, render under Caesar things that are Caesar's, and so we are caught up in that, but we forget the second half of that verse where it says, and to God the things that are God's. And so we're focused on giving the world the things that they're due, but we forget to give God the things that he is due. So that's just a little bit of small commentary. Sorry about that. There came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother died, having a wife but no children, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife and died without children, and the second and the third took her, and likewise all 7 left no children and died. Afterward, the woman also died. In the resurrection, which it said the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. Interesting. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had her as wife. And Jesus said to them, The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and to the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot die any more, because they are equal to angels and are and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him any question. But he said to them, How can they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. David thus calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And in hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. That is the end of Luke chapter 20. I hope that you're enjoying the reading, and sorry for the commentary, for interrupting God's word, but I hope that God is blessing you in the reading of his word. So we are going to continue with Lord of the Rings. I see that Jessica is here. Hi, Jessica. Just a minute. My book is over there, so I have to get up. I'm back. I'm also front. So, all right. I learned that one before I was a dad, so it can't technically be called a dad joke. Okay, so we are reading Lord of the Rings. We've read 1 chapter so far. And this chapter is slightly longer than the last chapter, so we are going to actually... and Jessica, I hope that you read the first, or listened to the first chapter, or read it, either one. With us. The prologue is just informative. So if you want to go, if something doesn't make sense to you that we read, then maybe you could go back and listen to the prologue, and maybe there's something that you could glean from it. But otherwise, it's mostly informative. I just read it for completeness. We are going to read half of chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. So in chapter 1, Bilbo was having his 11th birthday party, because he's just a little baby hobbit, I guess. His 11th birthday.
You can't goof off this time.
Okay. Oh, JJ's here to correct me. Just a minute.
Hi. Okay, Dad said it was his 11th birthday. He forgot a 1. It was his 111th birthday.
Do you remember how old Frodo was? 33.
33, yeah.
And
he was
so
33.
111 plus 33 is how much? 144,
44.
Which is the number of guests that they invited to the party. And that makes 1 gross. And Bilbo said that it's 1 gross, and everybody was offended because it was gross.
Yeah, that is true. He actually said something that's true. Okay, so what happened is it was his 111th birthday, and
And what? What did he do on his birthday? He made a speech, and
Yeah,
at
he
the end of
made
his
a
speech,
speech.
what did he do?
he made a speech, and at the end of his speech, he was just like, I forgot what he said, but he did say something, and he put on the ring, and he vanished.
But everybody already knew about the ring, right?
Nope, no one knew.
Oh, except
It
for
was,
who?
It was, I forgot.
Frodo.
Frodo, yeah.
Don't do that with the...
You're shaking the camera.
He put on the ring, and he vanished.
And then where did he go?
And then he went on an adventure.
He went back to his home.
Yeah, he went back to his home. And then he packed. And then
And he handed the ring to Gandalf so that Gandalf could give it to Frodo, right?
it fell on the floor. Okay, but what he said, what Bilbo said is, oh yes, the ring is in the letter up there. And then I always forget the wizard's name.
Gandalf.
Gandalf. I'm starting to be like him a little bit. Gandalf, he knew. I think he knew it wasn't in the letter,
And he called him out.
and he called him out. And then he was just like, "It's in my pocket," but it fell on the floor.
Well, he dropped it on the floor.
He dropped it on the floor.
I think he tried to hand it to Gandalf,
Yeah,
but Gandalf wouldn't take it.
Yeah,
And then he dropped it on the floor, and Gandalf sat there until Frodo got there.
yeah, and Frodo was just like,
And I
"Ooh,
think
cool!
I think
a
Frodo.
trinket."
I think Frodo is just now coming back in.
And
Oh, and then he cleaned up from the party.
isn't Frodo
The nephew.
the nephew? Yeah, but Frodo's also the person that's running the place now.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
because Bilbo left it to
Hobbiton.
him.
He's running Hobbiton, right? That's what
Yeah.
it's called.
No,
Yeah.
Bag End.
Bag
Hobbiton.
End.
Hobbiton is the town. Bag End is the house. The name of the house.
He's running Bag End.
All right, are we ready?
Yes. Now we are going to be reading
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2 of Fellowship of the Ring. Hope you enjoy. Here's my dad to read that. Howdy.
Strictly speaking, this is actually Chapter 2 of Book 1 of the Fellowship of the Ring, because there is Book 1 and 2. So, this is titled The Shadow of the Past, and I will henceforth begin. The talk did not die down in 9 or even 99 days, the talk about Bilbo's disappearance. The second disappearance of Mr. Bilbo Baggins was discussed in Hobbiton and indeed all over the Shire for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits and eventually mad Baggins who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend and lived on long after all the true events were forgotten. But, in the meantime, the general opinion in the neighborhood was that Bilbo, who had always been rather cracked, had at last gone quite mad, and had run off into the blue. There he had undoubtedly fallen into a pool or a river, and come to a tragic, but hardly an untimely end. The blame was mostly laid on Gandalf. It only If only that dratted wizard will leave young Frodo alone, perhaps he'll settle down and grow some hobbit sense, they said. And to all appearance the wizard did leave Frodo alone, and he did settle down, but the growth of hobbit sense was not very noticeable. Indeed, he at once began to carry on Bilbo's reputation for oddity. He refused to go into mourning, and the next year he gave a party in honor of Bilbo's 112th birthday, which he called a 100-weight feast. But that was short of the mark, for 20 guests were invited, and there were several meals at which it snowed food and rained drink, as hobbits say. Some people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up the custom of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year until they got used to it. He said that he did not think Bilbo was dead. When they asked, "Where is he then?" he shrugged his shoulders. He lived alone, as Bilbo had done, but he had a good many friends, especially among the younger hobbits, mostly descendants of the old Took, who had as children been fond of Bilbo, and often in and out of Bag End. Folko Boffin and Fredegar Bolger were two of these, but his closest friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybook. His real name was Meriadoc, but that was seldom remembered. Frodo went tramping all over the Shire with them, but more often he wandered by himself, and to the amazement of sensible folk, he was sometimes seen far from home walking in the hills and woods under the starlight. Merry and Pippin suspected that he visited the elves at times, as Bilbo had done. As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. Outwardly, he retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit, just out of his tweens. Some folk have all the luck, they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usual more sober age of 50 that they began to think it queer. Frodo himself, after the first shock, found that being his own master and the Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years he was quite happy and did not worry much about the future. But half unknown to himself, the regret that he had not gone with Bilbo was steadily growing. He found himself wondering at times, especially in the autumn, about the wild lands and strange visions of mountains that he had never seen came into his dreams. He began to say to himself, "Perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day," to which the other half of his mind always replied, "Not yet." So it went on, until his 40s were running out, and his 50th birthday was drawing near. 50 was a number that he felt was somehow significant, or ominous. It was, at any rate, at the age that adventure had suddenly befallen Bilbo. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old paths seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield and more often by himself, and Merry and his other friends watched him anxiously. Often he was seen walking and talking with these strange wayfarers that began at this time to appear in the Shire. There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at that time appeared or sent any message for several years, Frodo gathered all the news he could. Elves who seldom walked in the Shire could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing and not returning, but they were leaving Middle-earth, and were no longer concerned with its troubles. There were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens, and dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from the distant parts, if they wanted any. As a rule, dwarves said little and hobbits asked no more, but now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy and of the land of Mordor. The names the hobbits only knew in legends of the dark past, like a shadow in the background of their memories, but it was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that the evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council only to reappear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said. From there the power was spreading far and wide, and away, far east and south, there were wars and growing fear. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. Little of all this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits, but even the deafest and most stay-at-home began to hear queer tales, and those whose business took them to the borders saw strange things. The conversation in the Green Dragon at Bywater one evening in the spring of Frodo's 50th year showed that even in the comfortable heart of the Shire, rumors had been heard, though most hobbits still laughed at them. Sam Gamgee was sitting in one corner near the fire, and opposite him was Ted Sandyman, the miller's son, and there were various other rustic hobbits listening to their talk. "Queer things you do hear these days, to be sure," said Sam. "Ah," said Ted, "you do if you listen. But I can hear fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to." "No doubt you can," retorted Sam, "and I dare say there's more truth in some of them than you reckon. Who invented the stories anyway? Take dragons now." "No, thank ye," said Ted. "I won't. I heard tell of them when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in them now. There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's green," he said, getting a general laugh. "All right," said Sam, laughing with the rest. "But what about these tree men, these giants, as you might call them? They do say that one bigger than a tree was seen up away beyond the North Moors not long back." "Who's they?" "My cousin Hal, for one. He works for Mr. Boffin at Overhill, and goes up to the North Farthing for the hunting. He saw one." "Says he did, perhaps. Your Hal's always saying things he's seen, and maybe he sees things that ain't there. But this one was as big as an elm tree, and walking 7 yards to a stride if it was an inch." "Then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree, as like as not. But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree on North Moors." "Then Hal can't have seen one," said Ted. There was some laughing and clapping. The audience seemed to think that Ted had scored a point. "All the same," said Sam, "you can't deny that others besides our half-fast have seen queer folk crossing the Shire. Crossing it, mind you. There are more that are turned back at the borders. The bounders have never been so busy before. And I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say they are going to the harbors, out away beyond the White Towers." Sam waved his arm vaguely. Neither he nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers beyond the western borders of the Shire, but it was an old tradition that away over there stood the grey havens, from which at times elven ships set sail, never to return. "They are sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us," said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly. But Ted laughed. "Well, that isn't anything new, if you believe the old tales, and I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail, but I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire." "Well, I don't know," said Sam thoughtfully. He believed he had once seen an elf in the woods, and still hoped to see more one day. Of all the legends that he had heard in his early years, such fragments of tales and half-remembered stories about the elves as the hobbits knew had always moved him most deeply. "There are some, even in these parts, as know the fair folk and get news of them," he said. "There's Mr. Baggins now that I work for. He told me that they were sailing, and he knows a bit about elves. And old Mr. Bilbo knew more. Many's the talk I had with him when I was a little lad." "Oh, they're both cracked," said Ted. Leastways, old Bilbo was cracked, and Frodo's cracking. If that's where you get your news from, you'll never want for moonshine. Well, friends, I'm off home. Your good health." He drained his mug and went out noisily. Sam sat silent and said no more. He had a good deal to think about. For one thing, there was a lot to do up in the Bag End garden, and he would have a busy day tomorrow if the weather cleared. The grass was growing fast, but Sam had more on his mind than gardening. After a while, he sighed and got up and went out. It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quietly fading into night. He walked home under the early stars, through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party he had been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit, and after taking a good look at him, he went off again. During the next year or two he had turned up fairly often, coming unexpectedly after dusk and going off without warning before sunrise. He would not discuss his own business and journeys, and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then suddenly his visits had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. That's not really a window sound, but just imagine. Frodo welcomed his old friend with surprise and great delight. They looked hard at one another. "Ah, well, said Gandalf. "You look the same as ever, Frodo." "So do you," Frodo replied, but secretly he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn. He pressed him for news of himself and of the wide world, and soon they were deep in talk, and they stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after a late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of the study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm, and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and the new green of spring was shimmering in the fields and on the tips of the trees' fingers. Gandalf was thinking of a spring nearly 80 years before, when Bilbo had run out of Bag End without a handkerchief. His hair was perhaps whiter than it had been then, and his beard and eyebrows were perhaps longer, and his face more lined with care and wisdom, but his eyes were as bright as ever, and he smoked and blew smoke rings with the same vigor and delight. He was smoking now in silence, for Frodo was sitting still, deep in thought. Even in the light of morning he felt the dark shadow of the tidings that Gandalf had brought. At last he broke the silence. "Last night you began to tell me strange things about my ring, Gandalf," he said. "And then you stopped, because you said that such matters were best left until daylight. Don't you think you had better finish now? You say the ring is dangerous, far more dangerous than I guess. In what way?" "In many ways," answered the wizard. "It is far more powerful than I ever dared to think at first. So powerful that in the end it would utterly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess him. In Egirion, long ago, many elven rings were made, magic rings as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. A mortal, Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues, until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last. Sooner or later the dark power will devour him." "How terrifying," said Frodo. There was another long silence. The sound of Sam Gamgee cutting the lawn came in from the garden. "How long have you known about this?" asked Frodo at length. "And how much did Bilbo know?" "Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I am sure," said Gandalf. "He would certainly never have passed on to you anything that he thought would be a danger, even though I promised to look after you. He thought the ring was very beautiful and very useful at need, and if anything was wrong or queer, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and he was always worrying about it, but he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. Though he had found out that the thing needed looking after, it did not seem always of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight." "Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter," said Frodo, "so I have always kept it on its chain." "Very wise," said Gandalf. "But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit for that to himself, and he was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy. Thin and stretched, he said, a sign that the ring was getting control." "How long have you known all of this?" asked Frodo again. "Known?" said Gandalf. "I have known much that only the wise know, Frodo. But if you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There is a last test to make. But I no longer doubt my guess. When did I first begin to guess?" he mused, searching back in memory. "Let me see. It was in the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of 5 Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by a great ring as plainly it was. That at least was clear from the first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When at last I got the truth out of him, I saw at once that he had been trying to put his claim to the ring beyond doubt. Much like Gollum with his birthday present, the lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it, and soon got angry. There was little else that I could do. I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Saruman the White, but something always held me back." "Who is he?" asked Frodo. "I have never heard of him before." "Maybe not," answered Gandalf. "Hobbits are, or were, no concern of his, yet he is among the wise. He is the chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill my meddling. The lore of the elven rings, great and small, is his providence. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told against my fears. So my doubts slept, but uneasily. Still I watched, and I waited. And all seemed well with Bilbo. And the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again, but I said to myself, after all, he comes of a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet. Wait. And I waited, until that night when he left the house. He said and did things then that filled me with fear that no words of Saruman could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of the years since then in finding out the truth of it. There wasn't any permanent harm done, was there? Asked Frodo anxiously. He would get all right in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean. He felt better at once, said Gandalf, but there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, and as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about hobbits. Among the wise, I am the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises, soft as butter they can be, and yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it likely that some would resist the rings far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need worry about Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years and used it, so it might take a long while for the influence to wear off, before it was safe for him to see it again, for instance. Otherwise, he might live on for years quite happily, just stop as he was when he parted with it. For he gave it up in the end of his own accord. An important point. So I was not troubled about dear Bilbo any more, once he had let the thing go. It is for you that I now feel responsible. Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you, and about all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. Whatever. It would be a grievous blow in the world if the Dark Power overcame the Shire, if all your kind, jolly, stupid Bulgars, Hornblowers, Boffins, Bracegirdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginses, became enslaved. Frodo shuddered. But why would we be? He asked. And why should he want such slaves? To tell you the truth, replied Gandalf, I believe that hitherto, mark you, he has entirely overlooked the existence of hobbits. You should be thankful, but your safety has passed. He does not need you. He has many more useful servants, but he won't forget you again. And hobbits as miserable slaves would please him far more than hobbits happy and free. There is such a thing as malice and revenge. Revenge? Said Frodo. Revenge for what? I still don't understand what all this has to do with Bilbo and myself, and our ring. It has everything to do with it, said Gandalf. You do not know the real peril yet, but you shall. I was not sure of it myself when I was last here, but the time has come to speak. Give me the ring for a moment. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if either it or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked. No, said Frodo, there are none. It is quite plain, and it never shows a scratch or sign of wear. Well then, look. To Frodo's astonishment, and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly into the middle of a glowing corner of the fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. Wait, he said in a commanding voice, giving Frodo a quick look from under his bristling brows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up, closed the shutters outside the window, and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sam's shears, now nearer to the windows, could still be heard faintly from the garden. For a moment the wizard stood, looking at the fire. Then he stooped and removed the ring to the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo gasped. "It is quite cool," said Gandalf. "Take it." Frodo received it on his shrinking palm. It seemed to have become thicker and heavier than ever. "Hold it up," said Gandalf, "and look closely." As Frodo did so, he now saw fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring, outside and inside, lines of fire that seemed to form the letters of a flowing script. They shone piercingly bright and yet remote, as if of a great depth. I have a picture of it. I am not even going to try to read it. Of course, reading this language actually invokes the powers of evil, so I wouldn't want to read it even if I could. So, I cannot read the fiery letters, said Frodo in a quavering voice. No, said Gandalf, but I can. The letters are elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this is in the common tongue, is what is said, close enough. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It is only 2 lines of a verse long known in elven lore, 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. One ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. He paused and then said slowly in a deep voice, This is the Master Ring, the one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago to the great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it. Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand like a dark cloud rising in the east and looming up to engulf him. This ring, he stammered. How on earth did it come to me? Ah, said Gandalf, that is a very long story. The beginnings lie back in the black years, which only the lore masters now remember. If I were to tell you all that tale, we should be sitting here when spring had passed into winter. But last night I told you of Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord. The rumors that you have heard are true. He has indeed arisen again and left his hold in Mirkwood and returned to his ancient fastness in the dark tower of Mordor. That name even you hobbits have heard of, like a shadow on the borders of old stories. Always after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We shall be hard put to it. We should be very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks one thing to give him strength and knowledge, to beat down all resistance, break the last defenses, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. The 3 fairest of all, the elf lords, hid from him, and his hand never touched them or sullied them. 7 the dwarf kings possessed, but 3 he has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. 9 he gave to mortal men, proud and great, and so ensnared them. Long ago they fell under the dominion of the One, and they became ring-wraiths, shadows under his great shadow, his most terrible servants. Long ago, it is many a year since the 9 walked abroad, yet who knows? As the shadow grows once more, they too may walk again. But come. We will not speak of such things even in the morning of the Shire. So it is now. The 9 he has gathered to himself, the 7 also, or else they are destroyed. The 3 are hidden still, but that no longer troubles him. He only needs the 1. for he has made that ring himself. It is his, and he let a great part of his own former power pass into it, so that he could rule all the others if he recovers it. Then he will command them all again, wherever they be, even the three, and all that has been wrought with them will be laid bare, and he will be stronger than ever. And this is the dreadful chance, Frodo. He believed that the one had perished, that the elves had destroyed it, as should have been done, but he knows that it has not perished, that it has been found, so he is seeking it. And all his thought is bent on it. It is his great hope and our great fear. Why wasn't it destroyed? Cried Frodo. And how did the enemy ever come to lose it, if he was so strong and it was so precious to him? He clutched the ring in his hand, as if he saw already dark fingers stretching out to seize it. It was taken from him, said Gandalf. The strength of the elves to resist him was greater long ago, and not all men were estranged from them. The men of Westernesse came to their aid. That is a chapter of ancient history which it might be good to recall, for there was sorrow then too, and gathering dark, but great valor and great deeds that were not wholly vain. One day perhaps I will tell you all the tale, or you shall hear it told in full by one who knows it best. But for the moment, since most of all you need to know how this thing came to you, and that will be tale enough, this is all that I will say. It was Gil-galad, Elven King and Elendil of Westernesse, who overthrew Sauron, though they themselves perished in the deed, and Isildur, Elendil's son, cut the ring from Sauron's hand and took it for his own. Then Sauron was vanquished, and his spirit fled, and was hidden for long years, until his shadow took shape again in Mirkwood. But the ring was lost. It fell into the great river Anduin and vanished. For Isildur was marching north along the east banks of the river, and near the Gladden fields, as he was waylaid by the orcs of the mountains, and almost all his folk were slain. He leapt into the waters, but the ring slipped from his finger as he swam, and then the orcs saw him and killed him with arrows. Gandalf paused. And there, in the dark pools amid the Gladden fields, he said, the ring passed out of knowledge and legend, and even so much of its history is known now only to a few, and the council of the wise could discover no more. But at last I can carry on the story, I think. And that is about halfway through chapter 2. I don't have a timer on this. Maybe I should get something that I can put a little stopwatch on it, but I do know that we need to not read these super long chapters in one sitting, and I know that I didn't do that before either. So I hope that you're enjoying the story. We will pick up from that point after a brief synopsis of what we read, and God bless you all. Have a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow for the rest of Chapter 2.